At 3:17 a.m., the Ravenspoint Lighthouse blazed to life for the first time in 3 decades. The keeper's log from that final night describes a smell like ozone and wet earth suddenly filling the tower. Then, the frantic, final entry. It is not the storm, it is answering. Last night, when the impossible light returned, every digital clock within 5 miles of Ravenspoint simultaneously reset to 3:17. The few residents who were awake reported a low, subaudible hum that made their teeth ache, and a pervasive, metallic taste on the air. And from the cliff face, where the cold Atlantic spray meets the rock, came a new sound. A slow, deliberate scraping, like stone being dragged across stone. This is not a ghost story. Ravenspoint Lighthouse was never haunted. It was a beacon, and something has just answered its call. This morning, they discovered a 7th body at the cliff's base. The locals no longer look. They've turned their eyes away. A whisper has taken root in the village. The lighthouse beacon doesn't warn ships away from the rocks. They say it now draws them in. It beckons them closer. Our tale begins not in noise, but in shadow. John and Sarah Miller were not from here. The air here carried the scent of damp earth and something older, metallic. From Ohio, they came chasing a fresh start after a loss that hollowed their world. They purchased the old Ravenspoint Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage online, sight unseen. A project, they called it. A place to mend their fractured spirits. But the air in Ravenspoint carried the iron scent of salt and old, damp stone. A quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The tires crunched over gravel as a stiff Atlantic wind whipped around the car. Sarah exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. It's much larger than the photographs made it seem. John forced a cheerful tone. Solid bones. Look at that stonework. He gestured toward the ocean below. And the view. My God, Sarah. The cottage appeared quaint, but behind it, atop a jagged spine of rock, the lighthouse stood against a bruised purple sky, a skeletal giant of rusted iron and boarded-up windows. The town of Ravenspoint was a cluster of grim faces and lowered gazes. At the general store, owned by a man named Mike, with eyes like weathered slate, they got their first warning. Mike, not looking up from his work. Miller, huh? The cottage. You'll grow accustomed to the wind's persistent moan through every fissure. It's a low, mournful howl that seems to breathe with the structure itself. John says they're looking forward to the peace, but the air here is thick with the scent of damp earth and old, wet wood. Mike finally met John's gaze, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Peace is one word for it. You mind the cliff path after dark. It erodes something fierce, and pay no mind to the old tower. It's dead. Best leave dead things be. Sarah's voice was a hesitant whisper in the oppressive quiet. Is it unsafe? Mike offered a humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, it's safe. The air grew heavy with the scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic. That light hasn't shone since old Captain Halsey vanished from inside it back in '93. They say he locked himself in, and no one heard a thing.
The next morning, the door was still bolted shut from the inside. But the captain was gone. His coffee sat abandoned, gone cold on the weathered table. The initial week was all hard labor and briny air. But this silence felt unnatural, not an absence, but consumption of sound.
The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp salt, and something faintly metallic.
Sarah began experiencing unsettling visions.
The storm outside clawed at the windows as she stood at the kitchen sink, mug in hand. Through the downpour, she whispered a name. John? A figure stood frozen on the cliff's edge, stark against a sudden lightning strike. The air grew heavy with ozone as the storm's violence seemed to pause around that solitary floor. She blinks, and the apparition vanishes. Then came the dreams, not of the captain, but of the light, a single, blinding white beam slicing through the fog of her sleep, followed by a sound that wasn't a sound, a deep, subaural thrum that vibrated in her teeth and bones. John discovered her research, printouts, detailing the local legend of the Reaper's beacon. 7 deaths over 3 decades, all found shattered on the rocks beneath the abandoned lighthouse. Fishermen, a hiker, 2 teenagers. Each victim discovered after nights when witnesses reported something impossible. Insomniacs and late-night drinkers swore they'd seen a faint, spectral glow emanating from the lighthouse's sealed tower. John's voice was low, afraid of exhaustion. Sarah, it's grief. This place, it's getting to you. He gestured vaguely into the damp air, the scent of mildew clinging to every breath. Mike said they're just stories tales to scare tourists who don't come anymore, but his words hung in the stillness, thin and unconvincing against the weight of the silence. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper, thick with dread. The dates, John. Every single death. The local weather logs all mention a sudden, isolated fog bank just offshore each night it happened. A fog that no other station within 50 miles ever recorded. The tension finally shattered on a night so still and frigid they could hear the ocean's ragged breath against the cliffs. John, needing to prove a point, or perhaps just to prove his own nerve to himself, announced he was going to check the cottage's storm shutters. Both froze. A low, metallic groan, distant but unmistakable, drifted from the direction of the lighthouse. The wind, John insisted, his voice too tight. Just the wind. He took a flashlight and stepped out. The heavy wooden door thudded shut behind him. Sarah watched his solitary flashlight beam bob and sway through the oppressive darkness. The air outside carried the damp metallic scent of ozone and wet earth. Then she saw it. Not a figure, but a pale, sickly luminescence bleeding from the cracks in the lighthouse's boarded-up lantern. It was a light the color of bone marrow, of thin, spoiled milk. A faint smell of ozone and damp stone reached her, carried by the cold night air. Sarah's voice was a choked whisper. The light intensified. Not bright, but dense and parasitic, clinging to the tower like a spectral infection. Ancient machinery groaned from impossible depths, and the dense light rotated. A single, deliberate beam sweeping over the black ocean. Sarah screamed, fumbling desperately with the door handle, her voice cracking as she cried out for John. John, get inside. He turned toward her voice, the damp air clinging to his skin. He saw her at the threshold, her movements sharp with pen. Then his gaze lifted upward, into the oppressive darkness above. The lighthouse beam swept over John, freezing him in its spectral glow. A cold, intrusive light that felt less like illumination and more like exposure, like being x-rayed by something ancient and hungry. Then the deep, resonant thrum from Sarah's nightmare vibrating up through the soles of his boots, shaking the very ground beneath him. The air grew thick with a sharp, metallic scent of ozone and a deeper, earthier smell of wet rock. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, and John ran, the damp, salty air clinging to his skin as he plunged back into the welcoming dark. Sarah yanked him inside, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed in the dark kitchen. They huddled together, their ragged breaths the only sound in the sudden void left by the vanished flummox. A metallic scent, like ozone after a lightning stroke, lingered in the still air. Through the grimy pane, the distant lighthouse stood dark and silent against the night, utterly dead. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint scent of ozone and rot. John's voice trembled, barely a whisper as he stared at the corpse. What? What was that? Sarah's eyes welled with tears, a cold dread solidifying in her chest as she looked from the body to the darkness beyond. It's not a warning, she breathed, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. Mike was wrong. It's a signal, and it just saw you. They fled that very night, racing 40 miles inland to a bleak motel. The police listened, their weary nods and slow note-taking betraying a grim familiarity to such tales. The decision was made to sell the place, to bury the memory in the damp soil of forgetfulness. For a month, they clung to that fragile hope. Then the news bulletin broke the silence. A body had been discovered at the base of Ravenspoint cliffs. The air in the room grew thick with the metallic scent of dread. The report confirmed it was a man. A historian had been petitioning to have the lighthouse declared a heritage site, poking around its forgotten stones. They said he'd fallen, a tragic accident. The date of his death was last Thursday, but the air in his study still carries the faint, metallic scent of old ink and a deeper, unsettling dampness. John, pale and trembling, pulled up his phone's location history. Last Thursday night, he'd made a late-night coffee run, a simple, routine errand. The map displayed his route with clinical precision, each turn documented in cold, digital detail. At 11:23 p.m., the timeline showed a deviation, a wrong turn into what should have been a shortcut. His blue GPS dot had just traced the coastal highway, placing him less than a mile from Ravenspoint. Sarah's voice, hollow and distant, broke through the static. The beam, it touched you, it marked you. Her final words carried a terrible certainty. It doesn't have to be at the lighthouse. It just has to know where you are. They moved again. Farther this time. Arizona. No ocean for thousands of miles.
Just the dry, oppressive heat and the feeling that the empty space around them offered no refuge at all.
John tries to laugh it off now. A shared hallucination. Stress. But Sarah watches him, her gaze sharp and unblinking. The faint, metallic scent of ozone still clings to the air. He makes a joke, but his voice is thin, and his hands won't stop trembling. She watches him flinch at sudden, stark light, a visceral recoil she can't ignore. At dusk, he stands fixed at the window, gazing toward the horizon, as if anticipating a familiar cycle. A new theory has taken root in her mind. One she keeps from John, a secret that thickens the air between them. She believes the captain didn't vanish. He simply slipped into the waiting dark. He didn't just encounter the lighthouse's ghost. He became part of it. This isn't a place haunted by spirits. The lighthouse itself is the hungry ghost, a mechanical soul that sustains itself on death, converting mortal fear into blinding light. Its beacon doesn't guide ships to safety. It lures them to their end, feeding on the final terror. And once it sees you, once its spectral light paints your form, you're entered into its registry, permanently. In the final scene, Sarah sits alone, outside her home. A violent desert storm rages. A lightning flash illuminated the room for a split second, casting a stark white beam through the window. In that brief, searing light, a single bar of shadow swept across the wall. A perfect, rotating beam, She went utterly still, her breath catching in her throat as the metallic scent of ozone lingered in the air. She didn't turn around, paralyzed by the unknown presence the moving shadow implied. What if it's just about waiting? The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old copper coins, time stretched, measured only by the irregular, sticky drip of water from an unseen pipe. It was the waiting that hollowed you out, leaving only the raw, quiet terror of anticipation.